Okay, so this is our third meeting, okay? We have started with an introduction to the problematics of the relationship between philosophy and theology in Byzantium. Then we started our case studies, first being Saint Maximus the Confessor, and how he, in a way, engaged with ancient Hellenic philosophy. Now, tonight's talk will be on Saint John Damascene and the way he conceptualizes their relationship in question and the bearing that had subsequently in Byzantine thought. Now, this talk is going to be based on my quite prolonged sort of research engagement with the thought of John Damascene, and more specifically, I'm just gonna elaborate on a talk I gave some years ago, like 5 years ago, at Macquarie University. We had a workshop there on late antique philosophy and especially Neoplatonism and theology. The point was, how do you conceptualize the relation between Neoplatonism and Byzantine philosophy from a strictly historical point of view, not so much a systematic and theoretical perspective, but historically, which means basically what does the evidence show us regarding this sort of relationship. So the basic problem we sort of, let's say, identified in our introduction was the fact that theology took ancient Greek philosophy, what we call ontology, and by extension ontognoseology, because that's a continuum. The question of being, the question of knowledge, and the question of the means, the specific means used to go about these two questions, which is logos. This is a sort of coherent and cohesive, a continuous spectrum in ancient Greek philosophy. So they took ontology, ontognoseology, and turned it into ontotheology, which means that basically they used the same language, more or less, the same terminology, the same categories, but the discourse was different. So the language is the same, but the discourse is different, which means that the semantics, or if you prefer, the pragmatics of the use of the same language are different. Of course, this sort of appropriation and transformation is in itself problematic. It's not without problems, because the signs, semantically, linguistically speaking, the signs remain the same, and the significations are different. So in a way, you must be somehow an insider in order to be able to navigate this sort of tension between signs and significations and not be confused. Anyhow, that's the paradox of, we could call it the paradox of theological discourse. I open a parenthesis here, big parenthesis. The big problem and the big question is if there can be a theology, beyond this sort of paradox, beyond this sort of discourse, beyond this sort of language. And of course, if there can ever be, a theological discourse that is a God talk, which is not a paradox. I mean, in one way or another, even if you don't use ancient Hellenic philosophy, you're going to use the world's language. And that's not going to change, it's going to be the same. So you will be using what the world uses, but your use is going to be different. And this is going to be anyway, a paradox. And I close the parenthesis here. Now we saw in the second meeting how Maximus dealt with this sort of, paradox. Now, there is not only the paradox. We shouldn't just, limit the problematics, of the relation between theology and philosophy to a paradox. It's a big part. If you prefer, it's at the core, at the heart of what we are discussing, but it's not, taking up everything. There's also other stuff there, and there's what we call the innovative aspects of what theology brought to the philosophical tradition. So, of course, it addressed the traditional philosophical topics. Okay, like what is being, what is knowledge, what is the human as such, human condition. But then it brought new questions and gave its own answers, like, the questions about the uncreated and the created, especially the question about person, individuality, and of course then questions regarding freedom, and something that simply the Hellenic approach to life and reality couldn't really bother with, to put it that way, which is the question of evil. So these questions, freedom, personality, the evil and the created order as such, are the new things that come in. And we see them in Maximus. And of course we will keep on seeing them, of course, the work of St. John, and after St. John throughout the Byzantine period. Now, from a historical point of view, if we would like to look into definitions of Byzantine philosophy, because there are certain definitions, what is Byzantine philosophy? I suppose it's very pertinent, to say the least, to set the stage, so to speak, in terms of methodology and perhaps more broadly, in terms of epistemology for such an exploration. This is exactly what my, presentation tonight aspires to contribute to, this whole series of problematics and thematics we are exploring. Where and how are we supposed to find, trace, and identify the process of defining what has come to be called Byzantine philosophy. I mean, we can read a book, on Byzantine philosophy by a modern thinker, scholar. But within the tradition we are referring to, is it traceable? Is there a definition? Do they, the Byzantines themselves, embark on such a endeavor? In what sense is such a philosophy even conceivable as a philosophy, qua philosophy? Is there and why a historical distinctiveness to be ascribed to the Byzantine character of this philosophy? I have to admit, of course, that these questions are basically one and the same question asked from different angles. Angles that do, nevertheless, represent a crucial methodological differentiation. That is, the advancement from description through explanation to understanding. We usually, think of these three as being different. And they are, to an extent. But to an extent, they are also the same. Description, explanation, understanding. They are different and the same. So, allow me a parenthesis again. We say, okay, you stay at the descriptive level and you don't go into explanation or understanding. Yeah, okay, that's a valid point. But description is the let's say, the first step. And the first step is crucial. I mean, if you describe one way and you describe another way, or a third way, or fourth way, then what you will be explaining is different. It's not the same thing. Description is crucial. What do you see? We read a text. Are we reading the same thing? And I'm not talking in terms of, understanding. I'm talking in terms of, sheer, like raw words, phrases. Are we picking up? Are we stopping at the same phrases? Are we highlighting the same things? We're not. So we read the same page, but we're not on the same page. So when it comes to philosophy, Byzantine philosophy, we have a vast, a really vast, sort of deposit capital of texts and evidence, material evidence in every kind of sorts. So where we're gonna trace it, where we're gonna locate it, is very much an issue of seeing. To be sure, within the limits of tonight's talk, it's not possible to delve into or even to address this the aforementioned questions with regards to the entire scope of the Byzantine history of ideas. Hence, I have chosen to focus on what I believe to be an extremely formative case study, namely the oeuvre of John Damascene. And it's particularly intriguing because his case is so formative for Byzantine theology and its relationship to theology. Why is it so intriguing? Because he was already outside the limits of Byzantium. He was beyond Byzantium. Before I proceed to my case study, I would like to consider one of the major problems that still persist with regards to the definition of Byzantine philosophy. It is the distinction between theology and philosophy, and whether such a distinction is possible in the case of Byzantium. Although this problem is more often than not articulated in a rather simplistic way, insofar as it poses anachronistically, I would dare say, theology and philosophy as two totally different or for that matter, opposing fields of reference. This is, of course, the Enlightenment tradition. It does convey some truth, not totally, made up. Even, something that is false needs to have some sort of basis. Otherwise, it cannot, really sustain itself. More specifically, the relationship between theology and philosophy can only be thought of in a reflexive manner. Reflexive. This is a term used by Cornelius Castoriadis, okay? The modern Greek, France-based philosopher. He used this reflexivity. So, for instance, we talk about theology, okay? But we don't talk about theology in a vacuum. We talk about theology within a theological tradition. So we don't just, this is not just a reflection, but it's a reflexive process. It's the very tradition that, conditions us in a specific way to reflect. Since we are part and parcel of the very history within which this relationship, theology, philosophy, has emerged, and thus we can only think of the latter in the constitutive manner in which it has been posed and articulated, that is, as a fundamental difference. Okay, whatever the solutions have been given, whatever the solutions those might be, they presuppose a difference. Sometimes bigger, sometimes less, but the difference is there. Notwithstanding, a fundamental difference does not entail an opposition. Okay. As modernity or post-modernity would have it. And if anything, the Byzantines did not see this relationship as inherently or necessarily oppositional. Now, for instance, the Western theological tradition, okay, the medieval, does not again see it as oppositional. But for some reasons, there is something there that allows the West, when it enters modernity and postmodernity, to conceptualize it as opposition. Okay, we won't go into that because it takes us away from St. John Damascene. But the opposition starts with, a sort of, if you locate it, it starts emerging, within the incipient Protestant movement. Okay, it's not a Catholic sort of thing. It's a Protestant thing, and it's more because of or due to let's say reaction. It's a reactionary sort of response. Their rather alternative perspective, the perspective of the Byzantines, seems to have been one we could call a perspective of coherence. Coherence.
I thought you were going to say that.
Yeah. It's not just supplement. They're not supplementary. It's not a supplementary relationship. Complementarity, or apparel, Nowadays, it's very fancy to say, look, philosophy does its own work. It's here. Goes there. Theology does its own work. It goes there. So, parallels. Okay, good business. No one messes with the other. So we have two parallel worlds. The other is, the model of complementarity. Like you don't have something that I have, so I give it to you, and vice versa. Filling gaps of one another. The Byzantine coherence perspective is something much more integral. Okay. it's something I would say that does not allow us at the end, ultimately, to think of philosophy but as theology, and theology of something that by necessity is philosophy at the same time. But without, confusing. The problem is not whether the Byzantines were aware and made use of philosophy. It is ancient Hellenic philosophy. This is well documented. I mean, you must be some sort of a, either, amateur or, ignorant person, in terms of, scholarship that you don't know. I mean, the Byzantines used ancient Greek philosophy. So we know that. That's not the problem, that's not the issue. If they were aware and made use of it. They did. The problem is whether they had a philosophy of their own. And open a parenthesis here. We know that the Muslims used ancient Greek philosophy. Don't we know that? Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, names. But did they have a philosophy of their own? Is there such a thing as Islamic philosophy? That's the question. Not if they used ancient Hellenic philosophy. Did the Byzantines have their own philosophy? Okay, that's the problem. And in what respects was different from ancient Hellenic philosophy? Yet still remained philosophy. The question is very pertinent there, because the question basically is, can you have a philosophy which is not Hellenic? At the end of the day, that's the question. Can you? I mean, if you were Derrida or if you were Levinas, you would say, of course you can. And that's my whole project. To create a philosophy, to recreate a philosophy that is not going to be Hellenic. Damn the Hellenes. No? I'm going to make a Hebrew philosophy. Levinas, Derrida. Those who knew so much of Hellenic philosophy really adored it, had a hate and love relation with it at the same time. And they wanted to, do a different sort of philosophy. But is that possible? That's the question. If it's possible, then yes, the Byzantines could have a Byzantine philosophy. Yes, the Muslims can have a Muslim philosophy. Yes, the Chinese can have a Chinese philosophy. The indigenous can have an indigenous philosophy. That's very trendy nowadays, Talk about indigenous philosophy, aboriginal philosophy. Everyone talks about philosophy. Everyone has their own philosophy. But is that possible? Sorry?
Are you going to answer that question?
We're going to talk about the question afterwards. Ancient Hellenic philosophy was as hierophanic a life form as Byzantine theology was. It's very crucial. Ancient Hellenic philosophy is a hierophanic life form. Simply put, it's spiritual. It's a religious commitment. And thus, given the foundational change in their experience of the sacred, the Byzantines could not but pose the difference between theology and philosophy as fundamental. If they didn't pose that as fundamental, a difference, they would be ascribing, to the sacred that ancient Hellenic philosophy, ontology, ontognoseology, was based upon. But they were not idiots. They were smart people. They knew what was at stake. For the very same reason, though, they acknowledged the potential that ancient Hellenic philosophy could have in communicating hierophanic meanings. Because it was hierophanic, it had a potential in conveying hierophanic meanings. On the one hand, the hierophanicity of ancient Hellenic philosophy poses a limitation to the fathers. On the other hand, the very hierophanicity of that philosophy makes them realize that it can speak spiritually, it can be served, can serve the spiritual. Because that's what it has been doing, before us. This time, their own hierophanic meanings, the Christian ones. In other words, the Byzantines were bound to reject more or less the hierophanic actuality of ancient Hellenic philosophy. Actus, the actus, what was realized in history, in time and place, on the one hand, and accept more or less its hierophanic potentiality, potentia. So they were, in a way, Byzantines were saying the hierophanicity of ancient Hellenic philosophy has reached a level of degree of actualization, realization. But there is a residue there. There is something there which is still at the potentiality level, which has not been actualized. Has not been yet actualized. This is a very dynamic understanding of the ancient Hellenic philosophy, philosophical tradition. Because we know that tradition, was producing forms from period to period, from the 7th century, late 7th century, till the late 6th century, the early 6th century AD. For centuries, 12 centuries, it was producing forms. So, if you say, as the Hellenes would say, that this is philosophy, what has been actualized, realized, okay, but then the Byzantines would say, the Christian Byzantines I'm referring to, would say, okay, yeah, but this thing has been reinventing itself and has been changing, it has been adding, which means that there is a potentiality there expressing itself. What if you have not yet actualized the full potential of yours? What's that, residue? What's that thing that you haven't tapped in yet? That's what I'm interested in. Because it hasn't taken shape in history yet. But history alludes to its existence. Otherwise, there wouldn't be, the change, the very impetus and the very dynamics. So the potentiality is there. So I'm taking it, and now I'm going to become its history. I'm going to put it to work, for a certain history. Of course, the Christian history. This is the very crux of the problem we are dealing with, the paradox of Byzantine philosophy, in the sense that it is about a tertium quid, a third something, that was comprised of a potentiality, alluded, signified, that did not develop into an actuality according to its own entelechy. The entelechy is the historical trajectory of ancient Greek philosophy. That's the entelechy. For a variety of reasons, lots of complicated ones, it stops around 600. But the potentiality is there. If it hadn't stopped, it could have produced new things. But now it's gonna be, this potentiality used for something that was not in this entelechy. Entelechy, the Aristotelian teleology. And an actuality that was already given experientially. So it's like, it's like you are tapping in the hierophanic capital of ancient Hellenic philosophy and making it say something that it didn't say, and wouldn't say. And you are doing this by using ancient Hellenic philosophy itself.
You're using it as a methodology.
Yeah, you're using it for a purpose, that's not supposed to. It's like, for instance, we know what a knife does, eh? Okay. For instance, in purely Aristotelian terms, a knife is there to cut. Yeah, but what if I take the potentiality of a knife, which is inherent within the knife, and I use it for something that does not conform to this entelechy? For instance, I put it, on my desk, as an ornament, as a sculpture, as a piece of art. A knife as a piece of art. A knife that will never cut meat. A knife that will never cut anything. Is that a knife? It is a knife. But I'm using it, and for me, I'm relating to it as a piece of art. That's taking ancient Greek philosophy and making it do what it's not supposed to be doing. But doing it, yet, through its own potentiality. Not by infusing it with a foreign potentiality. The Byzantines opposed ancient Hellenic philosophy as a realization of one's desired position. Eudaimonia. To be the one favored by the gods. That they would oppose. And the purpose of philosophy is eudaimonia. That's the purpose of philosophy. What we call nowadays, in an Anglo-Saxon way, the good life. The good life. What the good life of the ancient Hellenes is not the good life. The good life is the life favored by the divine. Now, this position of eudaimonia within physis, nature. That's something they're going to oppose. But promoted ancient Hellenic philosophy as an exploration of one's given situation within physis. What's this situation? Phthora, deterioration. Allotriosy, what we call alienation. So, yes, physis, but not, the ideal aspired position, that you think the human being can have within physis, eudaimonia, but physis as the space within which the alienation of the human being, is exemplified. What we call, in traditional theological discourse, or in jargon, the fall. The fall. Okay. Again, it's within physis that you conceptualize, this sort of condition. But it's not being, perfect, but problematic. Physis not as the space of perfection, but physis as the space of a problem, fundamental problem. Phthora, deterioration. What's another word, Vicky? Phthora, phthirome? Decay. It is this intricate dialectics that I refer to as the Byzantine perspective of coherence. Such a perspective of coherence between theology and philosophy would have been simply out of place, if not absolutely impossible, before the 6th century. And if one takes into account also the dramatic changes effected through the advent and expansion of the caliphate in the 7th century, then the terminus post quem for the emergence of the coherence under examination will have to be placed within the 8th century. We'll see why it cannot be before the 6th century, before, let's say, 600. It presupposes lots of historical developments and, you know, processes that simply needed time. So what we are describing here, you know, is the final formulation of something, you know, that we see in a proliptic sort of way, sort of anticipated way in the fathers of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century. But it's still under creation. In particular, the leading centers of ancient Hellenic philosophy had kept their traditions alive until the early 6th century. The Hellenes were around. Okay, we know the school of Athens was there in the 6th century. Alexandria was there in the 6th century. Even the other centers, you know, like Rome, okay, was over as a center of Hellenic philosophy by around, you know, 450, the latest 500. But still, it's very close. The same goes for Antioch and Syria and Asia Minor. And thus, up until that time, one could claim philosophy either by belonging to those traditions or by appropriating the name and legacy of philosophy. You could say you're a philosopher because you would be a Hellene, you know, scholar, or you would be appropriating it and using. Okay. Well, for instance, you could be a student of Hypatia. That was enough in the early, you know, 5th century to claim the title of a philosopher. Why? I'm sitting with this lady, you know, and being taught by her, and she's the top. So what do you want? Okay? When are you a doctor? When you're studying you know, medicine at the university. I'm studying with Hypatia. So what am I? I'm a philosopher. You know? You don't need any other special credentials. Yet. In the latter case, we have to admit that, properly speaking, Christianity put forward only substitutes of philosophy. Okay, you could do that, but you would be sort of, you know, promoting a substitute philosophy, what we could call, you know, an ersatz philosophy. Like, okay, that's not really philosophy, just petty or pretentious. On the other hand, of course, this does not mean that Christianity did not engage through its theology in a large scale and critical engagement with the legacy, the problems, and the dead ends of ancient Hellenic philosophy. Quite the opposite. And this was an engagement that would prove indispensable for the subsequent emergence, consolidation, and development of Byzantine philosophy. But it was only when the death of ancient Hellenic philosophy left a cultural void, and this is early, okay, this is late 6th century, early 7th century. 630, both Olympiodorus and Simplicius, both are dead, 630. So a cultural void came in, that the Byzantines were provided with the necessary condition to produce a genuine philosophical replacement by drawing upon and transforming their critical theological insights. So it's not so much the sort of philosophical doings of the Byzantines that really made them create a Byzantine philosophy, because they would always remain at the, you know, in the shadow of the big legacy. It was their theology, okay, engaging with philosophy and trying to compete with it and coming up with new insights that is going to create new philosophical avenues. But what about the sufficient? This is the necessary condition, okay? The necessary condition. What's the sufficient condition of the production of Byzantine philosophy? Okay, The stage is set. But who's going to play the play? Who's going to act? What happened in the 8th century that marked the proper launch of this intellectual project? My answer is clear and straightforward: the so-called iconoclastic controversy and John Damascene. That's what happened. Although the controversy over the icon, and the icon is not just the icon, what we call icon convention. The icon is much more than the icon. And this is something that, even a very simple, cursory reading of John Damascene reveals to anyone. Because when John Damascene deals with the problem of the icon, he is dealing with the problem of reality. Because he says, more or less, everything is an icon. The controversy over the icon, although Lipon, and not the icons, this is a controversy about the icon, not about the icons, exclusively or specifically the icons, was a period of deep crisis. This is a period of deep crisis. It was at the same time a most fortunate period insofar as it revolved around a major, if not the most important philosophical problem. Which one is that? Signification. Semantics. What do I say? What do I think? What do I mean? At the end of the day, when we talk about the ontognoseo-logical continuum, the crucial part is the gnosis, the knowing. This is about signification. And I open a parenthesis here. We many a time, ridicule and talk a bit lightly about, the modern Anglo-Saxon, analytical tradition. Language, philosophy, blah, blah, blah. But these people they just made philosophy into a petty play. If you look at it from a different angle, the analytical, philosophy really, touches upon the very heart of the problem of philosophy. Language, signification, meaning. In other words, the eclipse of the old philosophy was followed by a problem that pressed for the creation of a new philosophy, especially in light of the fact that the life world was not the same anymore. The life world, everyday life, the situation changed forever. And this is especially in the 8th century with the, creation of the first, let's say, the first formulation of the limits of the caliphate as an Islamic empire. By the early 7th century. By the early 8th century. Islam in one century, in 100 years, created an empire. From 632 to 720, it had, really created an empire. So the world's not the same anymore. The old philosophy died, and now a new world has emerged, and how are you going to talk about it when the old philosophy is over? You need a new one. Because the life world ceased being nature-based. It's not nature-based anymore, the life world. Physics, but history-oriented. Now, slowly, gradually, they have come to the realization that, we are all about history and not nature. In this precisely in this connection, it is the presence of John Damascene through his seminal involvement in the Icon controversy, his philosophically well-informed work, and not the least thanks to his relative distance from Byzantium himself. This is good, because he is an insider-outsider. Okay. So, the presence of John Damascene seems to have had a significant bearing on the final resolution of the issues that were at stake at the time. Furthermore, in doing so, the Damascene also seems to have played a major role in setting the stage, for sure, unintentionally, for the distinctive articulation of the phenomenon we justifiably call Byzantine philosophy. Undoubtedly, John Damascene is not a philosopher, but equally so, philosophy does overflow throughout his work. I mean, I'm saying he's not a philosopher because if you would ask him, are you a philosopher? He would say no. Is this new? Is this something we would characterize as rare in previous patristic writers? You know, not being philosophers, but, you know, their work overflowing with philosophy. So much saturated with philosophy. Not at all. However, it is in John Damascene that for the first time philosophy, discernible as such, stands out in strikingly Christian counters and colors. As if ancient Hellenic philosophy was eventually coming out of a long-lasting process of transformation. You just have to, you know, read his, let's say, let's take something that one would regard as the most philosophical piece of his work, which is the chapters, the dialectical chapters, which is, you know, basically a compendium of definitions on logic. Now, if you read that, and everyone says that, you know, it has been influenced and it draws on, you know, the long Neoplatonic Aristotelian commentators on logic. Yes, it does. But if you read their works on logic, and you read John Damascene's work, you see the relationship. But what you see mostly, and unfortunately this has not, you know, been stressed enough, okay, is the difference, the otherness. Yes, if those were not there, the commentators of Aristotle, you wouldn't have had the dialectica of Damascene. But they didn't produce it. They were the necessary condition, but not the sufficient one. You needed an agent. You needed an individuality, you know, creative as such, in order to, in a way, summarize all these traditional commentators on logic. Okay, give it a good, you know, what's Steve Simon?
Squeeze.
Squeeze, and take the juices of what we have as dialectica. So, again, to recall what we said about description, when I read the dialectica, what I see is the difference, not the sameness with the tradition, the commentators of Aristotle. Now, for instance, when, let's say, what was that? I think it was Basilius Studa, a German scholar, who, when he read, you know, the dialectica, he said, what did he see? He saw the sameness. Okay, this is the same as the commentators of Aristotle. He saw the sameness. When I read it, I see the difference. It's what you see. And the sameness and the difference is there, but we haven't stressed the difference. I think it's time. And scholarship more and more does that. Indeed, one can find, trace, and identify. In other words, one can describe what John Damascene regards as philosophy, and according to my hypothesis, the very construction that was to become the outline of Byzantine philosophy, based on the programmatic function of the term philosophy within his writings, his profuse use of logical argumentation throughout theology. Okay. We say many a time that, and the Orthodox, sort of boast, well, we don't need arguments about the existence of God. We don't, these arguments have no value. But John Damascene is using arguments throughout the world, the fide orthodoxa. Throughout. An argument that, there is God. An argument that there is Logos. An argument that there is Spirit. An argument, that there can be no arguments, but an argument still. As well as consistent discussion of traditionally philosophical thematics. What I want to highlight is that these three levels of reference, okay, I'm going to repeat them. The use of the term philosophy. What is philosophy? Okay? The use of logic and the continuation of the traditional thematics. These three levels allow one to appreciate, in the case of John Damascene's oeuvre, not the unoriginal perpetuation of a tradition of selective interaction with the legacy of ancient Hellenic philosophy, as Andrew Louth has argued. And I do respect Andrew Louth. But it's not just a perpetuation of a tradition, and for that matter, unoriginal. But the original and innovative creation of a new eidos of theology. A philosophically integral and eclectic theology out of that very tradition. But if John Damascene enriched Christian tradition by putting forward a new mode of theology, he created a new mode of theology. This so traditional, father of the church, this so traditional, thinker, who said, I say nothing of my own. This, little bugger, this one created a new mode of theology. Mode. Not just, he said this or that. Somewhere, that is sort of a new. But a totally new mode of theology. This could hardly have been feasible within the critical situation of the 8th century without an accompanying breakthrough in terms of philosophy. Indeed, a new type of philosophy is to be found in his oeuvre. To be sure, in an incipient form, but with all those features that will become the full-blown ways of Byzantine philosophy. That's the title of a famous book by John Madoff, Ways of Byzantine Philosophy. Theology, basically, but I turn it to. As we know them in the 10th, 12th, and 14th, 15th centuries. So without John, you wouldn't, be able to really understand Photius, Michael Psellos, the controversy with philosophy, and the debates. We know the famous, persecution of philosophers during the 12th century. And of course, the Hesiastic movement. These features consist of, one, which are the features, that we have in Damascene, and they become, let's say, formative, fundamental for the Byzantine world. The explicit, unconditional, and emphatic affirmation of gnoseology as a broad field of reference that includes experiential and, in particular, religious knowledge. It's what Damascene dubs gnosis. Nowadays, perhaps we would call it science.
Clement of Alexandria had a similar.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Gnosis.
B, the understanding of logic. So, what does A mean? A means that, if you're doing theology and you have second thoughts about, about knowledge, human knowledge, okay, as a potentiality, as a aspect, as a feature, of the human being. If you have second thoughts and you think, it might be of the devil, it might be, a bit dodgy, it's not really, to be used or be trusted, then simply you're not doing theology. Okay? If you're doing theology based on, emotion, pure emotion, you're doing bullshit theology. Yeah, that's it. I mean, theology has an emotionality. But emotionality is not telling as a character sui generis of theology. Emotionality has Christian life. Christian life has emotionality. Well, like any spiritual, any religious life has emotionality. But religious life, spiritual life, in general, is not theology. They're two different things, in order to have a theology, you need spiritual life, you need emotionality, but you have to build upon that with something else. And that's not emotionality, because emotionality is the basis. So you don't create theology out of emotionality. Emotionality is for any Christian. B, the understanding of logic, not only as the organum, but also as the mediator in the very structure of experiential knowledge. With Damascene, logic is placed at the heart of theology. Because yes to knowledge, and this knowledge is rational, logical. Logic is at the heart of theology, because it's not just an organon, it's not just a pen. I use an instrument.